Kawhi Leonard was the key factor in the Toronto Raptors winning the 2019 NBA championship. But does that make him the number one Raptor of all time? Here's my top 5. What it do, everybody? Jacob Stoudemire here with Amateur Hour Sports, giving you my top 5 Toronto Raptors of all time. And we're going to get right into it, starting with number 5, Chris Bosh, drafted by the Toronto Raptors 4th overall in the loaded draft in 2003. This is the draft that saw Bosh go top 5 along with the GOAT, LeBron James, as well as Dwayne Wade and Carmelo Anthony. The other member of this elite top 5 in the 2003 NBA draft is none other than the legendary Darko Milicic of the Detroit Pistons, who went 2nd overall after LeBron James. Yes, for reference, Darko Milicic went before Melo, Bosh, and Wade. By the way, thinking about it right now, how different could the Raptors have looked had they drafted Wade at number 4 instead of Chris Bosh? Something to think about. But Darko Milicic, we can laugh our asses off at Detroit, especially for the basketball team that they have become today, but they also won an NBA championship that year that they drafted Darko Milicic. And they beat the Lakers, who had Kobe, Shaq, Gary Payton, and Karl Malone in their arsenal of players. And that doesn't get talked about enough because the Pistons took down that Lakers team in 5 games. And Darko Milicic, say what you want, he's got a ring, and Carmelo Anthony does not. Clearly, Detroit were doing something right at the time. Darko Milicic getting taken 2nd overall was not one of those decisions. But back to Chris Bosh. With the Raptors, 3 double-double seasons in his 7 years in Canada. All of those double-double seasons were with at least 22 points per game. He averaged at least 22 points per game as well in 5 of those 7 seasons, the 2 that he didn't being his rookie and his sophomore seasons. He never averaged less than 8.7 rebounds after his rookie year, where he got a respectable 7.4 rebounds that year. He helped lead the Raptors to 2 playoff appearances, one of those being as a 3 seed. He unfortunately did not ever win a playoff series with the Toronto Raptors, and that's why I'm going to have to put him at 5 on my list. Also, he left in free agency in 2010 to join the Super Miami Heat with Dwayne Wade and LeBron James, who also joined them. They all made a pact, I believe, to have their contract expire at the same time and maybe join forces on the same team. It just so happened to be in Miami. And you know, a lot of Raptors fans criticized that decision, but I mean, if I was Chris Bosh and I saw the trajectory that we were on, I would have done the same thing. Moving on, number 4 on my list, DeMar DeRozan. And you know, there could be a case for him to go a bit higher, but I have him at number 4 on my list. What can I say? He was the embodiment of the Toronto franchise for years. He helped lead us out of the dumps in the Eastern Conference, all the way up to contenders in that conference. He is the all-time leading scorer in Toronto Raptors history, and that is not something to take lightly. Even with all the history, we have had some great players, and this is only number 4 on my list. He also leads the Raptors in total games played. Had to be in the top 5. I know some of you are going to make the case that he should be a little bit higher, but you know, All-NBA 2nd team and 3rd team appearances while he was with the Raptors, and he also managed 27 points per game in 1 season. We cannot understate the gratitude for DeMar DeRozan in the city of Toronto, what he did for the franchise. However, the regular season DeMar DeRozan was not the same as the postseason DeMar DeRozan, unfortunately. There were lots of lackluster performances, and we couldn't quite get over the hump. You know, we had that one year where we took the Cavs to 6 games in the Eastern Conference Final, but you know, other than that, there wasn't really a lot going on with the Raptors in the playoff. There was a bit to be desired there. And as our best player, there was a bit of expectation on DeMar DeRozan to perform just that little bit better when it really mattered most. And, you know, especially in the clutch circumstances of the playoffs, Dwayne Casey iso ball with DeMar DeRozan, it just simply didn't work. And unfortunately, after we moved on, that's where the Raptors saw their greatest success of all time. But we will get there. Take nothing away from the impact DeMar DeRozan had on the city of Toronto. Absolute legend in these parts, like I said. The top scorer in the history of the Toronto Raptors. It was sad to see him go because, unlike other names on the list, He was one who did not want to leave, but, it is what it is at this point. Number 3 on my list, Vince Carter. There is a case, like I said, to put DeMar ahead of Vince here, but let's look beyond simply basketball for this pick. Let's look beyond what happened on the court, because Vince Carter put Toronto on the map. And make no mistake, Toronto and Canada are turning into basketball regions. But before the Carter effect, people in Canada just simply did not care about basketball. It was a hockey country. It was a hockey city. It was all about the Toronto Maple Leafs, especially in the GTA Toronto region. And Carter comes in after the 98 draft, where we acquired him from the Warriors, who took him 5th overall. We traded Antoine Jameson to get Vince Carter. He comes in and he turns the franchise around. There were some conceptions that basketball was really failing in Canada. After the expansion to one of the Toronto Raptors, the Vancouver Grizzlies were not performing admirably, neither were the Raptors, and eventually the Grizzlies moved on from Vancouver to Memphis a few years later. And that maybe could have been the fate of the Toronto Raptors if it wasn't for the effect that Vince Carter had on the entire organization. He made Toronto a place to play when it seemed like nobody wanted to play in Toronto. How it was going to be tough to get people who wanted to play in Canada, but he put us on the map. He came in, he wanted to play here. He was a highlight machine, and even made the likes of Kevin Durant want to be a Raptor growing up. That is the insane effect that Vince Carter had on the city of Toronto. Moving to the on-court portion of Vince Carter's career as a Toronto Raptor. He was a tremendous scorer. Eventually got us that playoff win that we so desperately craved in Toronto. But for the most part, playoffs were a bit disappointing other than that one series. And, there was that Game 7 loss in Philly that, we avenged last season, as you all know. And the Raptors, again, could not completely overcome that stigma against them, where people didn't want to play in Canada, where nobody really cared about basketball in Canada, nobody cared about the Raptors, even if you were an American, you were an NBA fan. But as our leader, I felt like Carter could have done a bit more in those big games, Not to knock it, but there's that big shot against Philly in Game 7. He hits that. We move on to the conference finals. Not going to hold too much against a tough shot like that, but those big moments where you really want your star player, your leader to thrive and pull your team above the rest. And unfortunately, Vince Carter never really could achieve that at any point in his career with no final appearances. The effect Vince Carter had on not only the city, but the country is good enough to put him at number 3 ahead of DeMar DeRozan. Without Carter, I don't think the Raptors are what they are today. But now we move to the top 2 players on the list. This is where we think, who's it going to be? Who's going to be the 1? Who's going to be the 2? Because there are 2 players left who I'm thinking of. And this is how I'm going to lay it on you. Number 2 on the list, Kawhi Leonard. And that maybe could come as a surprise to some of you who thought I would put him number 1. But, let me get to the positives first. Maybe he didn't want to play here. Maybe he didn't want to get traded to Toronto, to Canada. But Kawhi Leonard came in and showed the entire basketball world that he wasn't just still an NBA star after basically taking a year off in San Antonio. He came in and showed he was one of the best players in the world. And to some, not me, they would consider him the best player in the world as a result of last season and what they have seen this season. 27 points per game, over 7 rebounds in his one full season in Toronto where he played 60 games. Not to mention, almost 50% shooting from the field. Some unheard of, ungodly numbers from Toronto's number 2. And we love him, number two on the list. Absolutely remarkable what he achieved in the one season. Not to mention putting on one of the all-time great playoff performances to bring Toronto the elusive NBA championship that we may have felt we would have never reached. Finals MVP and the key player in that team, but with only 1 year, he unfortunately can't be the number 1 on the list because that spot belongs to, of course, Chuck Hayes. An absolute presence on the court, was physical tone setter after physical tone setter when he came off the bench. Chunk would just be that key spark you needed off the bench to come and show the opposition who is boss. He's that little difference maker that you could throw in and could just change the game. Not to mention that he shot a scrumptious 48% from the field in his one full season in Toronto in the 2014-2015 season. And who could forget his tremendous performances in the 2013-2014 postseason against the Brooklyn Nets. I will never forget that deep floater he hit in that series, and that is an absolute fact about Chuck Hayes. Nobody's going to forget that performance. Neither will our actual number one on the list, the future Hall of Famer, Kyle Lowry. Lowry's tremendous surge as a Raptor after dealing away Rudy Gay in order to acquire him and some other players led us to keeping many key players whose presences were important leading into the NBA championship season, even though that was so long ago. As DeRozan was hitting free agency, there was a great fear that he would decide to move on, like many of our other stars, like the Chris Boshes, like the Vince Carters. We didn't know what the fate of DeMar DeRozan would be, but as a result of Kyle Lowry's presence on the team, uplifting the other players on the team, putting on some career performances, getting Raptors, every year it seemed like we were getting our highest win total in franchise history. But we kept DeMar, we managed to re-sign him, and that was a key factor in acquiring what we needed to push us over that hump and get us the NBA championship, because we traded away DeMar DeRozan and Jakob Poeltl, not just for Kawhi Leonard, but also for Danny Green, as a result of the value that DeMar DeRozan had. Not to mention some of the other key players involved in that, but Kyle Lowry, his presence, his will for the Raptors to succeed, how he embodies the city of Toronto. That is the reason we managed to keep all these key players to push us on, to keep developing, because with Masai Ujiri at the helm, we were able to get all of the key pieces, the key ingredients together in order to win that NBA championship. He is the leader who broke us out of our dark ages into perpetual Eastern Conference contention and eventually NBA contention. He overcame the stigma against his abilities in the playoffs last season to become a key factor and a difference maker in the NBA Finals. Who could forget that magical 10-point first quarter in the ultimate deciding Game 6 against the Golden State Warriors in the Bay Area? No doubt. Unreal display from Kyle Lowry, willing us to victory when we needed him most. And it was the support of himself, among others like Fred VanVleet and Pascal Siakam. More names on that, but just those guys as the key factors in the success. Those are the guys that supported Kawhi, that allowed us to thrive and push on to get that NBA championship that we so desperately craved. We are allowed to prosper as a result of the sacrifices that Kyle Lowry has made throughout his entire Raptors career. Kawhi obviously was the key success factor in that championship run, but there were ballers all around him knocking their shots down, and that includes, no doubt, Kyle Lowry, one of the better ones in that cast. 6 straight All-Star appearances and All-NBA appearances, and maybe a case for another one this year. No player in Raptors history has left an imprint on the Raptors the size of Kyle Lowry. Consistent in his craft and his tenure, and the leader behind all of our successes. Kyle Lowry is Toronto. Thank you for listening. If you liked the video, be sure to Between the Legs 360 slam dunk that like button to show your support to the channel, and consider subscribing to Amateur Hour Sports for more content just like this. If you didn't like the video, be sure to let me know the level of my stupidity and where I went wrong in the comments down below. And as usual, we'll see you again next time.